Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Greg Rains Media Sermon Podcast. I'm posting my sermons on a 1-week delay, so be looking for episodes every Sunday at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. On those rare occasions when sermons aren't released on Sunday, you can visit gregrainsmedia.com and search through well over 7 years of archived audio sermons. Sermons are available through most of the popular podcast outlets, including Apple Podcast and Spotify. Additionally, you can access the podcast through my website, gregrainsmedia.com. And now, let's jump into God's Word. Good morning, everybody.
Hello. Good morning.
As always, it is great to see that you have come out to worship God. As always, it's our prayer that it will be in spirit and in truth. And we'll go to God's Word, hopefully, to find that truth. I want to share with you the title first, and then, of course, I got a little story I want to tell you. Hopefully this will kind of keep this in mind as we were going through this sermon. But I've called this a vessel of honor, and we're going to read this again just to get it set in our mind, and then I'll share with you a little something. So anyway, 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 20 says this: "But in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honor and some for dishonor." I want you to think about your house and the bowls that you use perhaps, and some are your really, really good ones. And if you're like us at home, I don't understand this, ladies. Maybe you do. But why do you have this really good china and we never, ever use it? Does that make sense to you? That don't make sense to me. You have this really nice looking stuff, but if it's never used, what good is it for? And it passes down from one generation to the next, and what does the next generation do? They don't use it either. Every day they just use paper plates and or some old plates, but they never use the good china. I don't get it. But those things would be vessels of honor, right? So picture all those things in your mind. Now, in 21 it says, "Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will become," notice this, "a vessel for honor." That's where I get my title. We all in God's kingdom want to be a vessel of honor. So anyway, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work. Now, the points from my lesson come from this next part, which I would suggest have to do. If you want to be a vessel of honor, how do you go about it? Well, here's how you do it. Number one, flee, verse 22 says, "Flee youthful lust, pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." So that is the formula for you and I to become vessels of honor. Now here's the story. I may have shared this with you before, but not very often. When I was growing up at home as a little boy, we had dogs outside. And if you have a dog outside, you want to have water outside for your dog, right? So we went through 2 or 3 like plastic containers, and plastic containers outside don't last very long. So my mom said, "Well, I've got an idea." So she went to the cupboard and she pulled out a stainless steel bowl. Probably some of you have one just like it in your house. Well, we took that stainless steel bowl outside, and that was for the dog. Now, most of the time, there was water in it. A lot of times when you'd have scraps or something and you were getting rid of it, so what would you do? You'd take it out and you'd scrape it out into, quote, the dog's bowl. That bowl, in any other household, it had been a great bowl to put on the table. Not our house. That particular bowl, that would scrape out the things from the table that we weren't going to eat, and put the dog would take its water from that. The dog would eat out of that. All the dogs we had throughout the years. There's nothing wrong with that until when I got married, we would have Thanksgiving at Carol's parents' house and the grandparents' house, and in their family, there's a tradition now. In our family, we didn't eat this, and maybe you do, and it's okay. But they would make something called, every Thanksgiving, they'd make something called a fruit salad. And guess what bowl, traditionally, the bowl that they would use traditionally, every single Thanksgiving, the fruit salad was, in my mind, in the dog bowl. I got to admit to you, I never, ever, ever ate fruit salad from the dog's bowl. Now, what part of it was, again, in my family, we didn't have that tradition. We didn't do that. And we didn't have fruit salad, in other words. And so, it was one of several things that was always there. And, I don't even know if today I've made that clear to them why. But the thing, that to me, that vessel, that stainless steel bowl that probably several of y'all have in your house. If I were to go to your house, you have it on the table, and you were to put food in it, I would have a hard time dipping out of that stainless steel bowl, because that is the dog's bowl. But our lesson this morning has to do with being a vessel of honor. And even if you are a dog's bowl, you can change. You can become maybe a vessel of honor. And we do it through these things that are mentioned. So, those things that are mentioned in verse 22 form the basis of our lesson for us to be a vessel of honor. So let's take a look at what we have here. Number one, notice it tells us we should flee youthful lusts. And we'll look at Genesis chapter 39, starting at about verse 7. And notice I've got it subtitled, we should flee youthful lust like Joseph did. So it says here, and it came to pass after those things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. Remember, he's in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar, Joseph is a slave. He brings this slave boy into the house, and he realizes every time I put Joseph in charge of something, it does well, and he gives him more and more responsibility in that house. But the master's wife, Potiphar's wife, cast longing eyes on Joseph and said, notice this, lie with me. Now, I don't think she's saying, come and take a nap with me. Do you? No. That is a sexual invitation, isn't it? And as I've said many times before, a lot of men in that situation would justify it and say, well, you know what? I was home, and my mean old brothers threw me in a pit, then sold me into slavery, and here I am in Potiphar's house, and, she's offering it, so why not? You can kind of justify, why shouldn't I go ahead and do that? But Joseph won't do that. Notice this, verse 8, but he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. In other words, I'm in charge of everything. And he has committed all that he has to my hand. Verse 9 says, there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. And notice this, how then can I do this great wickedness, and notice this, and sin against God? If I do this, I'd be sinning against God. Number one, I've already mentioned about Potiphar, and Potiphar's been really good to me. But you know what? Really and truly, most importantly, if I do this, this is wrong, this is wickedness. I am basically sinning against God. That's what it says there in the latter part of verse 9. Verse 10 says, so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, he did not heed her, nor lie with her, nor be with her. Now you know the rest of this story. She keeps coming on to him, day after day after day. And finally, there's a time when it's only those two in the house. And she must be a pretty confident woman. She grabs him and says, lie with me. And Joseph has to basically wriggle out of his robe, and he runs from there naked, trying to get away from this woman. Of course, what's that term? There's no hell like a scorned woman or something like that. So, okay, you rejected me. That's fine. When Potiphar gets home, she switches the story around. And you know that young slave boy you brought in our house? Well, he came on to me. As a matter of fact, here's his robe. Can you believe it? Can you believe he'd do that? Now, let's go back, though. I mean, that's the entire story. But let's go back to this idea of flee youthful lusts. It would have been very easy, as I said earlier, for Joseph to justify giving in to that. Well, why not? What's it going to hurt? You know, if God was really with me, He wouldn't have allowed me to be a slave here in Potiphar's house. I think I'm going to. You know, he could have justified it, but what did he do? He did the exact opposite. We also need to learn this lesson. Flee those youthful lusts, those things that are a temptation to us. What should we do? Go toward them? No. Flee them, run from them, and that's exactly what Joseph did. This young man in the house being propositioned this way. Again, I don't want to read things into the Scripture that's not there, but I think, from my reading of it, Potiphar's wife, number one, she was very confident, but why was she confident? I would think she was probably a very attractive woman. That's the reason she could make this, proposition to this young man. So it was indeed a real temptation, but what did Joseph do? He ran. He got away. Again, a great example for us today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 talks about temptations that we sometimes encounter. And here's what it says. Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth, says this. Notice this. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. In other words, there's no brand new temptations. They're all the same. Such as is common to man. But God is faithful. Notice this. Who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Did you catch that? Some kind of overwhelming temptation. Is there such thing as an overwhelming temptation that we don't have the ability? Yes. God promises that you won't be tempted beyond what you're able, goes on to say, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape if you look for it. Just like Joseph, the way of escape for him was just, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of this house. And even if that means leaving my robe in her hands, I've got to flee. I've got to get out. There is a way of escape. This verse finishes off by saying that you may be able to bear it. So if we want to be a vessel of honor, we have to flee youthful lusts. Now, that's the one thing we're told to flee. Everything else, the rest of this is talking about what we should pursue. If you don't do this, if you flee, okay, you flee that, but what should you go after? What should you pursue? Number one, pursue righteousness. Now this we find in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 1, about verse 8. And here the Babylonians, I guess you could say, are trying to wine and dine these young Jewish captives and trying to convert them over to the ways of the Babylonians. And Daniel's not having it. He's going to pursue righteousness. And it says here, but Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not, notice this, defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. What is he doing? He's pursuing righteousness. Even though here I am, I'm a captive in Babylon, and I've been brought in here as part of several young men who are going to learn the language and learn the ways of the Babylonians. But you know what? I don't want to have to defile myself. I want to pursue righteousness. At first, the chief of the eunuchs, when Daniel proposes, give us just vegetables and that kind of thing, and we don't need your wine, we don't need all these delicacies, we just want good food to eat. He proposes that, and the chief of the eunuchs says, You don't understand. I'm in charge of all you guys. If I start feeding you that way and you don't look as good, it's going to be my head on the chopping block. I don't know if I can do that or not. And, Daniel proposes for a short period of time, let's try it. They do it in about a week. The ones who don't eat those so-called delicacies and the wine, they look better than those who didn't. But the point is, what does Daniel do? He's pursuing righteousness, which is simply what is right. And I don't want to defile myself, and that's exactly what he does. So is there a lesson in that for us? I think so. How that we should live righteously in this wicked world that we're part of. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, I think has some really good advice for us as Christians. Notice what it says. And do not be conformed to this world. Now, is there a lot of pressure these days for all of us to conform to what the world says and the world's view? There sure is. And it goes against many times what is in the Scriptures, what we should be doing. But the world says, those old ways that are talked about in the Bible, those are so antiquated. Those are just old views we need to get away from. Here is the right way now. Here's what you should do. And so you have a choice. I can go along with it, or I can stand up for what's right. I can pursue righteousness. Again, Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, notice this, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's what we need to be doing. You want to be a vessel of honor? Flee the youthful lust and pursue righteousness. The next thing that's mentioned is faith. We need to pursue faith too. So we'll look at Abraham. Now here, as we're reading, his name hasn't been changed to Abraham yet. It's still Abram. But in Genesis 12, verse 1, I want you to think about the faith of this man. By the way, this 75-year-old man. Now the Lord had said to Abram, notice this, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. By the way, before we go on, think about that idea of get away from your family and from your father's house. In other words, established. You're established here. Rather than living in a tent, you have a place, a home, and I want you to leave that. What kind of faith does it take to leave that? That's what Abraham is going to do. He goes on saying, verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I suggest that's a reference to Jesus Christ Himself. Through your lineage, through your line, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that's a reference to Jesus Christ. And notice what this man does. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Can you believe that? Can you imagine the faith? How many of us would want to do that? How many of us, if God spoke to us that way, okay, I want you to leave everything you've ever known. I want you to leave your home. And I want you to go this place. I'm not going to tell you much about it. I just need you to go. How many of us would do that? I have lived in Jacksboro all my life. All 58 years of it. I've lived in Jacksboro. I lived there with my parents until me and Carol got married, and then when me and Carol got married, we went over just kind of behind my parents' house when my granddad's old house was still there, and we lived there for a couple years, and then we built a place off to just across the field from my parents on the other side. So again, I've never left Jacksboro. So if God were to ask me, Greg, leave Jacksboro, leave everything you've ever known from your father's house and that place that you've always called home and go, would I have the faith of an Abraham and say, yes, Lord, I'm going? You mean all this time I've been living in a house, but now what's going to happen? You know, do you realize Abraham was always, for the rest of his life was always wandering around and dwelling in tents. But he was definitely a man of faith. And we need to be people of faith. Again, I hope if God were to ask me to do that I would by faith say, okay, Lord, I'm going to do it. I just wonder. And how about you? Would you leave everything you've ever known, leave this place that you've always been, and go to this land that I'm not going to be real specific, just go to this land, the land of Canaan, dwell in there, go back and forth, all, here, up and down, and everywhere, but never have a place. That's what I want you to do. How many of us would do that? By faith, Abraham did that. As we think about faith, that makes me think of the testing of our faith and how we grow. It's trials and things like that test our faith. It says in James chapter 1, verse 2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Now, folks, if you want to talk about something that's counterintuitive, that's counterintuitive. Oh boy, I've fallen into a trial. This is great. That's what it says, isn't it? My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Why? Verse 3 says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. So the testing of our faith will produce patience in us. So what should we be pursuing though? Faith. Not just that, let's move on to pursuing love. And as I've got it here, this is something that Jonathan did. This is from 1 Samuel chapter 18. We'll read this in just a moment, but I will say, there are those today who want to take what I'm about to read and turn it into something it's not. There are those today who want to look at the relationship of David and Jonathan and kind of hint at, well, they were more than just good friends. It reminds me of an old Phil Donahue talk show I was watching one time, and this person was advocating for, the gay lifestyle and all that kind of stuff. And he said, you know what? Jesus surrounded himself with men and tried to make that mean something that it didn't mean. So when I read this, when we think about the love that Jonathan has for David, it's a pure type of love. It's not that thing that they're trying to hint at. That's not the type of love we're talking about at all. And is it possible for these two men to have that kind of love for each other that's not romantic and not sexual? It is. 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 3 says, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. I would suggest that was a pure love. And Jonathan took off his robe that was on him and gave it to David, and with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. If we want to be a vessel of honor, we need to be individuals who pursue love. Now, what kind of love are we talking about? Finding as many sexual partners as possible? Is that the kind of love when we say pursue love? That's not the love we're talking about. As a matter of fact, as Christians, what's the type of love that we should pursue? The very highest love there is, which is the so-called agape love. That's the kind of love that God has for humanity. And that's the type of love that we should try to imitate and have. The agape type love. But we should pursue this kind of love if you want to be a vessel of honor. So as we do that, we need to find ways to demonstrate our love to others. And in John 13, Jesus is speaking. Notice, John chapter 13, verse 34, notice this. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." Again, with that agape, highest level of love. That's how you should love each other, as I have loved you. How much did Jesus love us? He went to the cross and died for us. He didn't just die for His family and friends. He died for people who had no use for Him. He died for the worst sinners possible. He died for them because He had a love for those souls. Verse 35 says, "By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Again, we want to be a vessel of honor. And that's exactly how you and I become this vessel of honor. By pursuing, as it says here, love. The last thing that we pursue is peace. Let's take a look at that. And this, I'm going to look at the example of David toward King Saul. If you remember, King Saul was really, really jealous of David. At one point, as a matter of fact, King Saul really and truly wanted David dead, pursued him, went after him with his army, trying to kill him. But David never once, turned that around and tried to fight him back. And this is a good example of it. Here in 1 Samuel 24, verse 11, I guess I should mention what has happened is, of course, it mentions it in the verse, but King Saul has gone into a cave to, quote, relieve himself. David and his men are in there, and David comes up behind him and cuts a little piece of the king's robe off. Again, being that close with a knife to the king. And now he goes out, and now they're having this conversation. So, "Moreover, my father, see," David says, "moreover, my father, see, yes, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you." I could have, I was that close. "Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt my life to take it." Verse 12 says, "Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you." Even in this instance, he is pursuing peace. There's another story, about a chapter away from this one, where the army of King Saul basically falls asleep. And David and one of his servants go walking right into the camp. And here is David on one side of King Saul and one of David's servants on the other. And the servant says, "We've been on the run all this time, and this is the man who's responsible. Here, just let's take his spear, put it right there, maybe around his neck area, or maybe through his head, just all the way through the ground. If you snuff out this life, all the problems that we're experiencing will be over." And David says, "It's not up to me to kill the Lord's anointed. It's not my job. It's not my responsibility." Now, if you continue reading that story, I believe if you look, they take the king's water jug and his spear, and they leave. And then when there's a safe distance, they have a conversation, basically saying, "Look how close we were, and we could have done something, but we didn't." Again, the point is, what was David doing? He was pursuing peace. If he was pursuing war, he should have taken out the king, King Saul, right there. He did not do that. If you want to be a vessel of honor, what should you do? Pursue peace. Jesus also has something to say about this in the New Testament, how that we should be peacemakers. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9, short verse simply says this: Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. This morning, as you hopefully pictured that stainless steel bowl that dog after dog that we had at our house while I was a little boy would drink out of and eat out of, and we'd throw all kinds of slop in there. I think it's possible to go from being that kind of vessel to being a vessel of honor. But how in the world are you going to do it? You're going, as this says, you're going to flee the youthful lusts, aren't you? You're going to pursue the righteousness, pursue faith, pursue love, pursue peace. And when you do all those things, you go from being the dog's bowl to being a vessel of honor. We'll sing an invitation song here in just a moment, and as we sing that song, it's up to you to figure out where you are spiritually speaking. You know, I've never ever been one, when I give the invitation, there's some preachers who will lay a guilt trip on you and that kind of stuff. I just never ever have been that kind of person. It's just like, here's the information, and it's up to you to act on it. If you are a faithful child of God, that's wonderful. But if there's something in your life where you're not, and you're not a vessel of honor, then I would suggest you need to make some changes, because this life is so short. It's a trying ground. It's preparation for eternity. Are you prepared for eternity? If you are, that's great. I encourage you to keep on keeping on, but if you're not, then maybe you should make some changes, and this is an opportunity to do so as we stand and as we sing. And that brings this sermon to a close. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. Since I tailor the ending of the live sermon to those I see before me, I don't always mention the full plan of salvation. If you are not a New Testament Christian, just look at the examples of conversion in the book of Acts. On the day of Pentecost, those who heard the gospel message asked what they should do. They were told in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, to repent and be baptized. Also, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 said, "See, here's water. What hinders me from being baptized?" Philip said, "If you believe, you may." The eunuch said, "I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God." They both went down into the water, and Philip baptized the man. If you are no longer a faithful Christian, you should come back to faithful service. The latter part of Revelation chapter 2, verse 10 says we must be faithful unto death to receive the crown of life. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.